Hi, I'm Greg, and I'd like to welcome you today to the third in my 77 Adventure series of videos on Honda's CB and CL77 series of bikes. That is their 305cc parallel twins from the 1960s. In this series of videos, we aim to look at the bikes and perhaps the fun we have riding them and some of the places we go in the local area. Today, not so much an adventure, but I thought it'd be interesting to look at one of my bikes, which is a 1965 Honda CB77 that I refer to as the Cafe Racer. You might have different views on what a Cafe Racer is, but certainly this is a modified Honda CB77. We're here in my garage today. It might be nice to be outside, but it is raining today, so we're in the garage. You may have noticed there were some shower curtains behind me and wondered why. I've not been banished totally the garage, but when I'm spraying, I found I can set up 4 shower curtains, divide up half the garage, and that works quite well for paint spraying. And I thought they'd make a reasonable background for today's video. So I hope you find it of interest. We'll start with a bit of history of my bike. It's a 1965 UK bike, and in some point in its past it was submitted for restoration by the late John White of Rising Sun Restorations in near York. Now, John was known for his CB750 restorations, Honda CB750. So slightly unusual that he took this on, but I did check with him, and it was the bike he'd done. Unfortunately, the owner of the bike couldn't finish with the commission, so the bike was just put on eBay as an unfinished project. It was then bought by its previous owner, who tried to complete it, but ran into a lot of problems. He had some major oil leaks. He did get it running, but a lot of problems, so it was then sold on again, and that was when I purchased it. It was my first CB77, so I had quite a lot to learn to sort these issues out. I mentioned my bike was a 1965 model. There were a lot of changes made during the lifetime of the CB77. I'm not an expert. Even more changes if you go back to the early CB72s, the 250cc version. But there was a major change, and the bikes tend to be known as just early and late models. So the 1965 is what we called an early model, and I'll just sort of cover some of the major differences. Perhaps the one everyone knows about, or is most obvious, is the speedo. The early models have the clap hands speedo and rev counter, where the needles rotate in opposite directions and meet towards the middle. The later ones have a more conventional combined unit with both rotating in the same direction. It's perhaps worth noting that the speedo drive for these speedo rev counters also varies. They rotate in different directions, so be careful not to mix up the drives and speedos. Something else that changed, another major change, were the forks. The early models had steel forks. Later they changed to aluminium. Something else we can perhaps see here is just the finning on the barrel. The earlier ones have quite a rounded profile that's obvious in the middle here. The later ones are quite an angular cut. Other little changes like the side casing where the clutch cable goes in, that differs, for instance. The actual frame is a bit different on the early models, and the swing arm, the construction of the swing arm, and the spaces for the rear wheel change as well. So quite a lot overall changed from one model, the early model, to the late model. Other internal changes as well. Some of the splines on the gearbox, for instance, they changed. Things like the cog that's driven by the electric start, even that differs. So you have got to be certainly careful if you're looking at parts for these bikes to make sure they're for the model you have. I mentioned my bike had a number of modifications, so we'll have a look at some of those. Start with, starting at the front, we have alloy rims fitted with stainless steel spokes. These are a Spanish Morad rim, not a company I'm very familiar with, but they are nice rims. They do look good. Moving along, one of the major changes are the carburetors. These are off a early Honda CB750, so they retain the cable pull operation rather than lever, which means they're sort of direct replacement. The standard carbs are on the CB77 are at 26mm K-hin. These are more essentially a 28mm, but they're slightly oval. Their mounting is different. Standard carbs have a flange that just bolts onto the inlet or bolts onto the head. These have a stub inlet and outlet, so you had to make up some alloy inlets, and then we have a rubber joiner. I'm trying to remember, but I think I ended up using rubber boots from a Honda VFR 400. So that's quite different. So a larger carburetor and a different inlet system. To accommodate these carburetors, the fuel tap had to be moved, so it's now further back on the tank to give room for the carburetors. You'll also notice that the carburetors are horizontal rather than being angled down to the head. Another consequence of that is that the standard air filters won't fit. So I'll just take this off to give you a clear view. Okay. So I just run pod filters with these, perhaps not as large as I would like, but they're fairly free flowing and seem to work okay. Perhaps difficult to see in there, but because the pod filters aren't securely fixed to the frame, I had to put in some support for the carburetors, so there is some diagonal alloy bracing I put in there, just so I found the weight of the carburetors would tend to pull them out of the manifolds eventually, so that's gone in there to support them. Okay, moving along to see what other modifications. Footrests, gear change. Honda brilliantly provide 3 positions for the footrests, there and there. I've moved mine to the rearmost position, the most racy, and for the gear change to work you just need to put in a new longer rod to operate the gear change, so I've made that up with a couple of rose joints. I did end up changing the operating lever for something I made from a pit bike gear change, but it was really only because the splines on the one I had were wearing a bit. So footrest on the rearmost position, and then exhaust. It's fitted with Gold Star replica exhaust. These are essentially a straight through exhaust, an absorption exhaust, so rather than the baffled exhaust that comes standard on the CB77. So that's another change. Moving along, obviously a non-standard seat. This was something I produced myself on a standard pan. Not a work of art. I'm not the best seamstress, has to be said, but I was interested to have a go. I like to try out different skills. Partially successful. With raising the footrests, if you go too low on the seat, you just haven't got enough room for your legs. So I wanted to keep the height, but give myself a bit of support at the back. So in that sense, it's worked. What I have found, the materials I used, the piping for instance, isn't really up to the job. So perhaps have another go at that sometime. But it was an interesting exercise in trying to develop a pattern and build up a seat. Then we have shock absorbers. It's got open coil Hagon shocks rather than the standard enclosed shock absorbers. And then I've made up some number boards to let everyone know it's a 77, and they just add to the look. I've also put on some indicators, just from a sort of safety point of view. These were a cheap set available on the internet that I thought looked retro, so I put those on, sprayed them. I think they came satin black, so they were sprayed gloss black to match the rest of the bike. They were very dim, so I've also fitted those with LED bulbs, and they're just about acceptable now. Coming further up on the bike, I made up a little fly screen, give it a bit of a retro racer look. Just a piece of perspex that you can mould bend with a bit of heat, and a bit of alloy cut to support it, to give you a nice little fly screen there. So I think they're the main modifications. I also fitted a modern solid state regulator and rectifier, just essentially a cheap Chinese version that I've fitted to bikes and never had any problems with them. They seem to work very well. Obviously the switchgear on the left hand side isn't standard because it needs to operate the indicators, so that's an aftermarket switch rather than the standard switch. And a bar end mirror I fitted again just to make it look a little racier. I did mention that there were some problems when I purchased the bike. The main one was perhaps a major oil leak at the front of the engine. When I stripped it down, I found that someone had tried to put a brass tube in to stop that leak. Obviously it wasn't working and shouldn't have been there in the first place, so quite a lot of investigation to sort that out. That ended up being a slightly warped barrel that was the problem, so that was skimmed to sort that out. There were other problems in the gearbox and some wear of the internal chains, so quite a lot of work to do to sort the engine out. Unfortunately, when it was rebuilt, it did actually seize after a while, and on further investigation found that some of the oilways had been blocked by someone who rebuilt the engine previously. There was sealant in oilways that had blocked the feed to the crank, and that seized. So it was a crank seizure rather than a piston seizure. So I got a lot of help and advice to resolve these problems, and that's been great to work with people who really know these bikes. That's been a real pleasure. The bike's obviously rebuilt again, and it's now running very well. And I'll try and start it up for you so you can hear it. I haven't started it for a while, so we'll just see how we get on. Though I must remember to remove the shower curtains before opening the garage door. The two don't go well together. So we'll go for a start up. Quite cold today, and the bike hasn't been run for a while, so it may take a little while to get it going, but we'll see how we get on. Fuel on, full choke, open the garage door. Ignition on. So get on. sounds quite nice with those Gold Star silencers. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting, and I'll see you on the next one.